a pastor, a judge, a wedding, a cat, and then murder. The night started with love. The next morning, blood covered the floor. Pastor David and Judge Linda had been married for just 24 hours. Their wedding was small but elegant. Friends and family had gathered, smiling, taking pictures. Everyone thought they were the perfect couple. But nobody knew what was coming. Nobody knew that a simple thing, something so small, so unexpected, would turn their honeymoon into a crime scene. It all started when David entered their bedroom. Linda was brushing her hair, still wearing her white satin nightgown. She smiled at her new husband. And then the smell. A horrible, strong, disgusting smell filled the room. David's face twisted. He covered his nose. "What is that?" he asked, stepping back. Linda laughed. "Oh, that's just Muffin," she said, pointing to the orange cat sitting on the bed. David's stomach turned. His face darkened. He stared at the cat. "That smell is from this thing?" he asked. Linda frowned. "Muffin is my baby. I've had him for years." David took another step back. His eyes burned. His nostrils flared. "Linda," he said, his voice low, "this is not normal." Linda crossed her arms. "It's just his fur. He gets a little smelly sometimes." David's hands clenched into fists. He had grown up in a strict, religious home. Cleanliness was everything. Dirt, mess, bad smells, they were signs of sin. And now, in his own home on his wedding night, he was trapped with something unclean. The cat purred. The smell got worse. Something snapped inside David. He walked over to the bed. He picked up Muffin. Linda's eyes widened. "David, put him down." David didn't answer. He walked toward the bathroom. He turned on the faucet. Linda ran after him. "David, stop. What are you doing?" But David wasn't listening. He grabbed a bar of soap. He grabbed Muffin's fur. He started scrubbing. The cat screeched. It clawed at David's arms. Linda screamed. "Stop." David growled. "This thing is filthy." Muffin scratched his face. Blood dripped down his cheek. And then, something inside him snapped. David threw Muffin across the room. The cat hit the wall with a sickening thud. Silence. Linda gasped. Her eyes filled with tears. She ran to Muffin. The cat twitched. It let out a small, weak cry. Then it stopped moving. Linda turned around, her face pale. "David," she whispered, "what have you done?" David's chest rose and fell. His hands were shaking. He looked at the blood on his skin. He looked at Muffin's lifeless body. And then he looked at Linda. He had seen that look before. In courtrooms. On the faces of criminals. Horror. Disgust. Judgment. David took a deep breath. We're going to call the police," he said. Linda didn't answer. But she took a step back. That was all he needed to see. He lunged. Linda turned to run. But David was faster. His hands wrapped around her neck. She kicked. She struggled. She tried to scream. But the only sound was the ceiling fan humming. A minute later, silence. David let go. Linda's body dropped to the floor. Her eyes, once so sharp, so full of power, stared up at the ceiling. David stood there, breathing hard. His wedding night was over. His wife was gone. The cat was gone. And now he had to hide the truth. But secrets never stay buried for long. David stared at Linda's body. His breathing was heavy, his hands shaking. He stepped back, pressing himself against the cold bathroom wall. His mind raced. This wasn't supposed to happen. This was his wife. They were supposed to spend their lives together. Preach together. Build a future together. But now she was lying on the floor, lifeless. The house was silent. Too silent. Even the ceiling fan seemed to slow down, as if mourning. David took a deep breath. His hands were still around his own neck, feeling the ghost of her last struggle. He looked down at his shirt. Linda's fingerprints were there, faint but real. Proof. Then his eyes landed on Muffin's body. The cat's fur was still damp. Its little paws curled in, frozen in place. David swallowed hard. His stomach twisted. He had to think. He had to act. But where would he hide her? The church. Yes, the church had a basement. A storage room where no one went. David closed his eyes. No, too risky. He could take her somewhere far. Somewhere deep in the woods. But how? He had no plan. His thoughts were interrupted by a sound. A vibration. Linda's phone. It was on the nightstand, buzzing. The screen lit up. A name flashed across it. Detective Ross. David's heart pounded. Detective. She had friends in law enforcement. Of course she did. She was a judge. His hands trembled as he picked up the phone. He stared at the screen. The call ended. Then, another vibration. A message. Linda, are you up? I need to talk to you about that case. Urgent. David's throat went dry. If she didn't answer, people would get suspicious. If they got suspicious, they would come looking. He needed time. He needed to clean. David dropped the phone onto the bed and turned toward Linda's body. He had no choice. He had to move fast. He grabbed a bedsheet, spread it out on the floor. Then carefully he dragged Linda's body onto it. It wasn't easy. She felt heavier than before. Dead weight. David gritted his teeth. He wrapped the sheet around her, tucking it in tight. Her face disappeared under the fabric. He lifted her. His muscles strained. Sweat dripped down his forehead. 1 step. 2 steps. Slowly he carried her out of the bedroom, down the hallway. He needed to get her to the garage. Into his truck. Drive out into the night. But just as he reached the stairs, a noise. A creak. David froze. His eyes darted toward the front door. Someone was outside. A shadow moved behind the glass. A knock. David's breath caught in his throat. Linda? A man's voice. Are you awake? Detective Ross. David's grip tightened on the sheet. Linda's body pressed against his chest. The knock came again. Louder. David swallowed hard. He forced himself to breathe. Think. He couldn't answer. But if he stayed silent too long, Ross would get suspicious. Another knock. Then the doorknob turned. Locked. David exhaled. Thank God. But then, Linda? I can see your truck in the driveway. I know you're home. David's pulse pounded in his ears. He set Linda's body down, gently, silently. He wiped his sweaty hands on his pants. He moved toward the door. If he opened it, what would he say? Could he lie? He reached for the handle, hesitated, then pulled the door open just a crack. Pastor David? Ross frowned. Where's Linda? David forced a smile. She's sleeping, he said. His voice sounded too calm. Too normal. Ross narrowed his eyes. At this hour? David nodded. Long day. Ross didn't look convinced. Mind if I come in? He asked. David's stomach twisted. He couldn't say no. That would look suspicious. But Linda's body was still on the stairs. Just a few feet away. One wrong step and Ross would see it. David forced another smile. He stepped back, opening the door wider. Ross walked in. His eyes scanned the room. David's hands clenched into fists. If Ross saw anything, if he suspected anything, David would have to do something about it. Something permanent. But then Ross sniffed the air. He frowned. What's that smell? He asked. David's stomach dropped. David felt his breath catch in his throat. His mind raced. The smell. That damn cat. Muffin's body was still in the bathroom. The air was heavy with it. Damp fur. Ross sniffed again. His eyes narrowed. Smells bad in here. He took a step forward. David forced a chuckle. Linda's cat, he said quickly. Had a little accident earlier. I was just about to clean it up. Ross glanced around. Where is it? David's heart pounded. He couldn't let Ross near the bathroom. In the tub, David said, scratching the back of his head. Linda gave him a bath, but, cats don't always smell great. Ross wrinkled his nose. Jesus. Smells like something died in here. David swallowed hard. If Ross kept pushing, he'd find the cat. Then maybe he'd find Linda. David needed to get him out. Fast. Look, Ross, David said, forcing a yawn. Linda's asleep and it's late. You needed something? Ross didn't answer right away. He was looking past David toward the stairs. David shifted, blocking his view. Ross finally sighed. Just wanted to go over that case with her. But I guess it can wait till morning. David nodded quickly. Yeah, morning's better. Ross didn't move. He just stood there, staring. David felt sweat trickle down his back. He gripped the door frame to keep his hands from shaking. Then Ross took a step forward. David tensed. Ross was looking at something. Something behind David. David turned his head slightly, just enough to see. The floor. The sheet. A tiny corner of it peeked out from the base of the stairs. Just enough to make someone wonder. David's stomach twisted into knots. Ross's eyes flicked back to David. What's that? He asked. David's mind screamed. What? No. Oh, he said, forcing a laugh. That's just, laundry. Linda was changing the bedsheets earlier. Ross tilted his head. Why's it on the stairs? David swallowed hard. She was bringing it down to wash, he said quickly. Guess she forgot. Ross didn't blink. Didn't move. Just kept staring. David's hands balled into fists. If Ross kept asking questions if he got any closer, mind if I use the restroom? Ross asked suddenly. David's blood ran cold. He shook his head quickly. No actually. The sink's leaking. Linda's been after me to fix it. Ross raised an eyebrow. That's so. David nodded. Yeah. It's a mess in there. Water everywhere. Ross didn't look convinced, but after a long moment he sighed. All right, he said, stepping back toward the door. David nearly collapsed from relief. Ross reached for the handle, then paused. He looked David in the eye. Tell Linda I stopped by, he said slowly. Tell her to call me first thing. David nodded quickly. Will do. Ross stepped outside. David shut the door. Locked it. Then he stood there, breathing hard, hands shaking. That was too close. Way too close. Ross knew something was off. He wasn't done. David turned back to the stairs. Linda's body was still there, hidden under the sheet. He had to move faster. Before Ross came back. Before anyone else showed up. David bent down, gripping the sheet tighter. He pulled Linda's body down the stairs, careful not to make noise. He had to get her to the garage. Into the truck. His heart pounded as he reached the door. He grabbed the handle, then froze. The motion light outside flicked on. David's breath caught in his throat. Someone was out there. David didn't move. He stood still, gripping the door handle so tightly his knuckles turned white. His breath was shallow, his heart slamming against his ribs. The motion light outside bathed the driveway in a cold yellow glow. A shadow moved. David's stomach twisted. He turned his head just slightly, just enough to peek through the small window next to the door. A figure. Standing near his truck. Ross. No. Too short. Too thin. David's fingers trembled. He squinted. Then the person stepped forward. The neighbor. Mrs. Howard. An old woman, probably in her 70s, always peeking out her window. Always watching. David swallowed hard. She was looking around. Eyes sharp. Suspicious. Did she hear something? Did she see Ross come by? David's pulse pounded. He needed her to leave. No. She took another step. Looked at the house. David pressed himself against the door. Held his breath. Go inside. Go inside. Please just go inside. But Mrs. Howard didn't move. Instead she bent down. David's gut clenched. She was looking at something. Something on the ground. David's heart stopped. Footprints. Dark, wet footprints on the driveway. Blood. Linda's blood. David's body locked up. If she saw it, if she followed it, if she knocked, he'd have to do something. His hands were already dirty. What was one more? He watched, breathless, as Mrs. Howard stood up. She frowned. Tilted her head. Then she walked back to her house. David didn't move until she shut her door. Then he exhaled, body shaking. He had to hurry. Ross was suspicious. The neighbor was watching. Time was running out. He turned back to Linda's body. Gripped the sheet tighter. Opened the garage door. The truck sat in the dim light, waiting. David dragged Linda's body inside. He gritted his teeth as he lifted her, struggled to get her into the back. He climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine. The noise echoed in the silence. He gripped the wheel. He had to be smart. The woods? No. Too obvious. A lake. Yes, the lake. Isolated. No one went there at night. David put the truck in reverse, backing out slowly. The motion light turned off. The street was quiet. He pulled onto the road, keeping his hands steady. Keeping his breathing slow. Just drive. Just focus. No mistakes. Every turn felt too sharp. Every streetlight felt too bright. But finally, the trees thickened. The road narrowed. The lake. David pulled in, shutting off the headlights. Silence. Stillness. He opened the door. Stepped out. The night air was heavy. Thick. It smelled like wet earth and old water. David moved to the back of the truck. Opened it. Linda's body lay still under the sheet. This was it. The last step. He grabbed her arms. Pulled her out. The gravel crunched beneath his feet as he dragged her toward the water. The lake was calm, dark, endless. David took a deep breath. Then he waded in. Cold. I see. The water wrapped around his legs, pulling, sinking. Step by step he went deeper. Linda's body floated slightly, the sheet billowing out. David pushed forward. Deeper. The water reached his chest. He let go. Linda's body drifted, weightless. The fabric darkened, spreading out like a ghost. Then she started to sink. Slow. Silent. Gone. David stood there, chest heaving, water lapping at his shoulders. It was done. No body. No evidence. No one would know. He turned. walked back, climbed into the truck dripping wet. His hands gripped the wheel. He looked into the rearview mirror. His own eyes stared back. Cold. Empty. He started the engine. Drove away. But something inside him whispered. This wasn't over. David gripped the steering wheel tighter as he drove away from the lake. His wet clothes clung to his skin, the cold seeping into his bones. The road ahead stretched into darkness, the headlights cutting through the thick night air. It was done. No body. No proof. But the weight in his chest didn't lift. His hands felt dirty. His skin crawled. He flexed his fingers, but the sensation wouldn't leave. As the truck rolled through the empty streets, his mind raced. Ross was suspicious. Mrs. Howard had seen something. What if Ross came back in the morning? What if Mrs. Howard talked to someone? What if a flash of red? David slammed the brakes. His heart jumped into his throat. His breath hitched. He looked up. Nothing. Just the road. Just the dark. But he had seen something. A shape. A figure. Standing in the middle of the road. Or had it been his mind? David swallowed hard. His pulse thundered in his ears. His hands trembled as he pressed the gas. The truck moved forward, slow at first, then faster. Home. He just needed to get home. The streetlights flickered as he pulled into the driveway. He turned off the engine. Sat there. Breathing. Thinking. The house was dark. Silent. Empty. His stomach twisted. Linda should have been inside. Should have been in bed. Should have been waiting for him. But she wasn't. Because she was gone. David clenched his jaw. This was his new life now. He stepped out of the truck. His boots crunched on the gravel. A light turned on. David froze. His neighbor's window. Mrs. Howard. Her thin shadow moved behind the curtain. Watching. David's chest tightened. He forced himself to move. Slow. Normal. He reached the front door. Unlocked it. Stepped inside. Silence wrapped around him like a thick fog. He shut the door. Locked it. His wet clothes dripped onto the hardwood floor. He needed to clean up. David moved toward the bathroom. His shoes left faint, muddy prints behind him. The door creaked as he pushed it open. The mirror reflected his pale, hollow face. His eyes were rimmed with red, his hair damp and messy. He turned the water on. Splashed his face. The cold sent a shock through his skin. He gripped the sink, knuckles white. Breathe. Just breathe. Then a sound. A soft, muffled noise. David's head snapped up. His pulse pounded. He turned off the water. Listen. Silence. Had he imagined it? No. There it was again. A faint scratching. Coming from behind him. David turned slowly. The bathroom door stood open. The hallway beyond was dark. His stomach coiled. Scratch. Scratch. The sound came again. From the bedroom. David's breath hitched. His skin prickled. He stepped forward, slow, careful. His heartbeat echoed in his ears. He reached the bedroom door. Paused. The air felt heavy. Thick. His fingers trembled as he pushed the door open. The room was dark. Still. Empty. Except the closet door. Slightly open. David's body stiffened. He hadn't left it open. Scratch. Scratch. The noise came from inside. His throat dried up. He stepped closer. His fingers gripped the handle. Pulled. The door swung open. Darkness. Close. Nothing else. David let out a shaky breath. He was losing it. His mind was playing tricks. He turned. Then his breath stopped. A shadow. In the mirror. Behind him. Watching.